to this second show and tell for the taxi and private hire vehicle passenger safety discovery. I'm James Graham, Delivery Manager at CDPS. Please note that this is going to be recorded and distributed after this presentation and will be made publicly available. So if you're not comfortable being recorded, please turn off your cameras now. If you have any questions as we're going along, pop them in the chat and we'll cover them at the end. Diolch. Okay, so we understand that everyone wants to know the findings and recommendations. So before we get there, we'll just quickly run through the context and wider research methods of how we arrived there. So some of you may know the Welsh Government has committed to legislate to modernise the taxi and private hire vehicle sector. As the Welsh Government developed proposals for a bill and after a wide consultation with the trade, Welsh Government engaged CDPS, that's us, to do a discovery on looking into passenger safety in the hopes that we can improve it. So it's important to note that this project was focused specifically on passenger safety and sits as one part of the much wider bill. So, however, we're acutely aware of the feedback in the last show and tell. So not only did we speak to many passengers, but also many drivers and operators from across Wales to get varied responses from the widest range of people possible in the time frame. So this is all part of what is called user-centered design, where we speak to actual users or customers, drivers, etc., and solve their real-life problems before we just go off and make any recommendations or design something that's not fit for purpose. So the point of this discovery is to speak to the customers and users themselves and create a list of recommendations that Welsh Gov can use to improve the bill and the safety of passengers in the trade. It's kind of how it works is we're an agile team and we work efficiently and effectively. And there have been a few changes to the team throughout the project, with a few people coming in as others move to other projects, but the work and the output remains the same. We're really proud to have integrated as one team with the Welsh Gov to share knowledge, ways of working, and of course, working in the open. So we're actually really excited to show you what we've been up to and where we've been. And I'm going to hand over to Adrian from Welsh Gov to detail more about the scope of the project. Over to you, Adrian.
Sorry, James, I had a bit of trouble unmuting myself. Bore da pawb, I'm Adrian Davies from Welsh Government Taxi Team. So as James said, Welsh Government committed to legislate to modernise the taxi and private hire vehicle sector during this Senedd term. And the purpose of that is to address cross-bordering and reform licensing to make services safer, fairer and greener. Previous reviews by the Law Commission and the Department for Transport's Task and Finish Group have recommended that sharing licensing information between local authorities and with passengers could help to improve safety and confidence of passengers. So we were keen to explore the benefits of sharing licensing information, and we wanted to take a user-centered approach to really understand how local authorities and passengers might use information in real-life situations. Local authorities have information about the cars and the drivers that they license, but they don't have information about vehicles and drivers licensed by other authorities. Through the bill, we propose to give local authorities powers to engage anybody working in their area. So we wanted to understand more about how local authorities would do that kind of enforcement work. Would they have the information they need, or would they be able to get it? Would it be useful for local authorities to share information? How might they do that? And what are the implications for the trade if local authorities are sharing license information? The other thing we wanted to do was understand the attitude and behaviours of passengers to using taxis and private hire vehicles. What safety concerns, if any, do passengers have? What actions do passengers take to keep themselves safe? Would passengers be interested in receiving information about licence holders? And if they would, how would they make use of that information? And how do people in the trade feel about their licensing information being shared with passengers? So, as I said, we wanted to take a user-centered approach to understand what works for passengers, for the trade and for local authorities. And the results will inform our policy for taxi and PHV licensing. So we decided to work with CDPS because of their skills and knowledge in user-centered design. And the project team has been very busy over the summer, talking to people. And I'm going to hand over now to James, who will tell you what CDPS has been up to and what they've learned.
Great stuff. Hi, everyone. So I'm James Bordwell. I'm the user research, one of the user researchers on this project. And I'm going to talk you through some of the research findings. First up, this has been a joint effort. It's very much a team effort. So everyone in this team has been involved in some way in the research, and particularly Tom, Liam, and Gabby have been heavily involved. It's not just me. Great. Next slide, please. So a bit of context. We're talking about taxis, and when I say taxis, I'm going to use that as a catch-all for both taxis and private hire vehicles, unless I explicitly say differently. So at the end of 22, beginning of 23, there were 9,753 licensed taxis in Wales, and based on the travel survey data, we've estimated that there were 22 million taxi journeys in Wales last year. And from those 22 million taxi journeys, people travelled approximately 108 million miles. Give you some context for that, some dimension. It's 93 million miles to the sun. So the Welsh people collectively travelled further than it is to the sun, but not quite there and back. Cool. Next slide, please. If you skip this one for now, if you don't mind, thank you. So in terms of the research that we did, we conducted 57 interviews. 32 of those interviews were with passengers and 25 with drivers. Of those 32 passengers we spoke to, we did 10 full interviews and 22 guerrilla interviews. Now, for the phrase in lay terms, the full interviews were those that we recruited for in advance. We explicitly went out with a quota of the kind of person we were after speaking to. The guerrilla interviews were very much kind of field work on the street in and around in Wales, speaking to people who were taking taxis or about to take taxis. So less planning involved in those particular interviews. We've got a real, as you can see from this graphic, we've got a real spread of where those interviews took place. So this was not Cardiff centric. This was very much representative geographically of, more representative of all of Wales. Great, next slide, please. The majority of the people we spoke to, the passengers we spoke to, were from underrepresented groups. So we spoke to people, wheelchair users, blind, people who were blind, and those with neurodiverse conditions, including autism, and also those from both ethnic minority backgrounds and people who identify as being LGBTQ+. The research was almost an equal split of men and women. We didn't have anyone that actually explicitly said they were non-binary. Although we did have one person that said they were transgender, and then we had a mix of age profiles. So the reasoning for this, the reason that was our slight focus for when we looking to recruit people, is that underrepresented groups, if we focus on underrepresented groups, it helps the more inclusive design. And if we design for those members of society, it typically benefits everyone positively. Great, next slide, please. So I'm going to jump into some research findings. So this is perhaps a pretty obvious one, but it's really important and worth stating. So sense of safety is very personal and is dependent on the context within which you're taking the journey. It is not static. It's not like, a car might pass its MOT and that is a benchmark for what is safe, what is deemed safe to take on the road. people's understanding of what is safe is kind of unique to them. And that came across very strongly. So what was safe to the different people we spoke to was quite fluid and dynamic. Next slide, please. I've got a couple of quotes that give you a sense of that. So things like the ethnic background of an individual, whether they were able-bodied or they had a disability, and whether they came from or whether they identified as LGBTQ+, all played a role in how they identified what was safe. So this first one is from a wheelchair user. So what worries me is if the drivers are tired. I worry they're working long hours and it's not safe. I try to see how they look when they pick me up. So this was a user who had actually been trapped in a car previously when it had broken down. So they were acutely aware of the implication that if the driver was tired, the implication of what might happen in an accident and what that would mean for them. So they would be reliant on someone to help them to get out of the car. So really an incredibly kind of, when you've got that background, this takes on a different inflection. It kind of means more. So this user was particularly keen to make sure the drivers were awake, alert, so that they were less likely to be involved in an accident. Next slide, please. This second quote is from a female user who was using taxis regularly to get to work. Someone who'd moved to Wales within the last couple of years, was originally from London, and identified as LGBTQ. Not quite sure which, whether within that spectrum, like where she sat, but she was very self-conscious of the image she presented outwardly to other people. So her quote is, "I'll try and make eye contact with the driver when they arrive to see what they're like. I try not to engage with the driver. I just have to tread carefully and not trigger people to come after me or to get angry at me or something like that can put me in any kind of situation." This particular user had been involved in an experience on a London bus that had been quite traumatic. She was still dealing this, the aftermath of that was still something she was dealing with TfL. But she felt safer in a taxi than she would on public transport, especially when it's quiet. But the relationship with the driver was one that she felt was very acutely aware of. You know, she was a black woman in a country where she didn't feel like she was necessarily, she wasn't Welsh. And she was trying to negotiate the relationship with the driver to see whether she would feel safe. And that was done kind of just in time, in an instant when the driver was picking her up. She was trying to understand whether this was going to be a safe situation for her. Next slide, please. So you can see that safety means different things to different people. As a white middle-aged male, it's very transactional for me often, but for other people, it's far less so. So what are some of the strategies that people are using to stay safe? Let's have a look at some of these things. So if you go to the next slide, thank you. So some people are identifying friendly drivers and booking them directly. So we've heard from a few people, particularly those wheelchair users or people who have mobility problems, that having used operators or ride-hailing applications would make contact and spring up a conversation with their driver and look to see if they'd be willing to take them if they were booked directly. One person in particular spoke about this, a wheelchair user, not an electric wheelchair user, someone who put the wheelchair in the back of the cab and then needed the support of the driver to support them into the taxi and out of the taxi. And they had 3 different drivers that they had identified and would book directly with, almost kind of like a chauffeur. It was kind of nice the way that he talked about his relationship with these drivers. They were as much carers as they were drivers for him. It's quite an intimate relationship when someone has to pick you up and carry you in and out of a wheelchair. And he wanted to know that he was safe and people would do that, and he was safe with those people who were doing that. Vouching for drivers. So we would hear that from users who had, let's say, a spectrum of different drivers that they knew and would call on. If none of those were available, then they would look to hire a different driver or use a different operator, but only if a friend or relative had vouched for that driver. So it was a kind of like the trust mechanism working through the social graph, which was also interesting. Thirdly, one probably more familiar with, we heard from younger people, especially at the weekend, who would text and call ahead. So if they were getting into a taxi, especially if they were alone, they would text a friend or relative just to say, look, I'm in a taxi, I'm on my way home, should be there in 15 minutes. We didn't necessarily get any details of whether they would include the license number or the taxi driver's name or anything like that. We didn't hear that, but certainly they were giving generic information on their journey. And last one, sharing journeys. So again, typically younger female passengers at night would look to share journeys with friends rather than go alone. Great. Next slide, please. So this, we're going to dive a little bit more into people who have mobility issues, disabilities, and how they find taking taxis and being passengers in taxis. And the high level thing here is that it's harder. You know, it's harder to access the taxis when they need to, and to use them and to feel safe while they're doing so. Next slide, please. So I've got a few quotes here. So this is from an electric wheelchair user. He said, they just jam me in. They don't clamp me in. And they say, oh, you don't need that. This user was well aware of the law around this, but the safety tests are only conducted when users are clamped in. So this user was fully aware that if they weren't clamped in, then the risk to their life, should there be an accident, was significantly increased. And same user, I worry about being trapped and have nightmares about burning to death in the cab. Only the driver would be able to help me to get out. This particular user had been involved in a crash when they were a child, and that experience, quite traumatic for them, was still playing out in their experiences, their current day experiences of taking taxis. Next slide, please. Actually, I'm going to say perhaps a little bit more about that. Am I going to say more about that? No, I'll come back to that later. Next slide. Sorry, Jen, I'm messing you about. For people who have disabilities, booking a taxi usually necessitates speaking to an operator. So if you live in Cardiff, I live in Sheffield in England, you're probably used to using ride-hailing apps. If you're in a rural area of Wales, that may be less so. You're probably still used to booking over the phone. But for wheelchair users and people who have specific needs, those needs are very rarely catered for through the app. They need to speak to an operator to understand whether their needs can be met, whether there is a wheelchair accessible vehicle, or whether their specific driver that they know will meet their needs is available. So there's greater friction. It's more difficult for them to book the taxi. And the availability of wheelchair accessible vehicles is not clear. They're often scarce, and that affects the wait times. So again, they're reliant on the operator to give them that information. Often the operator isn't always transparent with that information. And if they are, it can be wildly out. So the wait times are very variable and not always particularly accurate. Just some data to add some context to this. So this is from Department for Transport data. So there are, taking the fleet of taxis and private hire vehicles, the number of wheelchair accessible vehicles is under 15% as an average for Wales. And if you take each individual licensing authority, the average for each one is slightly under 10%. Next slide. Thank you. And lastly, just around mobility and particularly on access needs for people who have disabilities. Knowing where you're going to be dropped off takes on extra significance. So it's not just about the booking process, which is often more difficult, more challenging. Negotiating where you're going to be dropped off, knowing where you're going to be dropped off, is also of greater significance, and that can be really stressful. So there's often more planning involved in the journey. So knowing where you want to be dropped off, what the immediate context within which you're going to arrive is like. Is it safe? Is it a busy road? Can you cross that road? Is there a crossing? If you're a blind user. If you're a wheelchair user, are there accessible? Is the immediate area got any steps or any doors which you need to be aware of, which you might need help with? And mainly the driver to help you with. And secondly, that's kind of like related to that is the relationship with the driver takes an extra significance. You're more reliant on that driver to support you in that context, especially if it's a context, if that immediate environment is not one you're intimately familiar with. Right, next slide. And following on from that, what we heard in the research was a lot about this relationship between the driver and the passenger. It came through often in the kind of the subtext of what people are talking about was how they felt in dealing with the driver or in engaging with the driver. And likewise, we heard that from the driver too. Trying to understand the passenger was really important to understanding whether they would feel safe. So I've got a couple of quotes here. The first one is a user with pretty severe autism. And they said, I worry about safety a lot. I get confused. So by having something to talk about, obviously, you know, in a car, say, Joe, when I'm talking about, when I'm talking about all see his mate Jerry, for instance, or see his mate Jerry, for instance, is Jerry okay? I haven't seen him for a while. And it's a way to actually break the ice. I can't do that with a random stranger. So what he's trying to say there is he needs to know, it puts him at ease to have that conversation with the driver, and for the driver to know that he knows people, they have someone in common. Without that, he can get very anxious, and it can be a trigger for his autism, and provide a very stressful and difficult situation for him, where he would feel very unsafe. So that's the first quote. The second quote, this is from a person who's blind. So living in rural North Wales, unfortunately, I've got no talking buses. So I've got to rely on the taxi man, or woman, and the bus driver to tell me where we are. I've got to ask them. So can you please let me know when we've arrived at the destination? So again, it taps into this idea of the relationship with the driver being far more significant to people with disabilities or from some of the minority groups we've talked about. It takes on a different kind of inflection. There's more going on there for them. Last slide here. So, and this doesn't just apply to passengers. So this is about drivers too, right? We've spoken to drivers, and that relationship with passengers is key for them as well. So drivers feel particularly vulnerable with passengers who are under the influence of drink and/or drugs, and that's not just for safety reasons. Although, if you go to the next slide, Jen, this is a quote which struck us, which really cut, we really felt this when the driver was talking about this. I don't fasten my seatbelt. I don't want to be used to strangle me from behind. So that was one driver. We had another driver who would wear the top strap under the arm for the same reason. But this isn't just about physical safety. What we also heard from drivers is that if passengers are under the influence of drink or drugs, it puts the responsibility on them to take care of them into a different realm. If that person is incoherent, potentially unconscious or falls unconscious, or if they're in a situation where they could be taken advantage of, what does the driver do? What is the role of the driver? How do they negotiate that situation? And it's very difficult. It's very challenging for them, and it puts their safety and their, because of the responsibility they're taking on, into a different realm. Correct. So what I want to say in this slide, actually these slides are the wrong way around, so this is about, well, so things are going wrong. So people are having experiences in taxis where they don't feel safe. However, the vast majority of journeys, people do feel safe. And we heard a lot about from passengers about how grateful they were for the experiences of the drivers where they've gone above and beyond to support them. But clearly there was lots of situations where passengers, particularly passengers with, like I expressed, from underrepresented groups, are feeling unsafe. And we're interested to know, what are the complaints like? What's the feedback like? So this slide is just attempting for us to gauge that. So if we're saying that the estimate of taxi journeys in Wales is approximately 22 million a year, we know that the total number of complaints is estimated, and this is based on complaints data we've received from just over half of the licensing authorities, is approximately 1,647 or so. It would seem to be under 2,000. And driver-specific complaints, about 614. Is that seems to us to be very low, based on what we've heard from the amount of passengers we've spoken to about the experiences that they're having. It doesn't seem to be representative. So we're wondering perhaps why that is. If you go to the next slide and then back onto the next slide after that. So why do complaints feel so low? Well, we heard this from passengers we spoke to. There can be awkward and uncomfortable interaction with the driver. They're effectively kind of captive in the back of that taxi, and the power imbalance during the journey feels unequal. They're also unclear what happens to the information. So if they were to make a complaint, what data of theirs gets shared? Does the driver get to know their name, their address? It's unclear. Then we heard from, this is from one user in particular, the only one we spoke to who had made a complaint, but it was just to the operator and not to the licensing authority, was that they said they just want to get out. They hope to never ever see that taxi driver again, and just wanted to remove themselves from that situation and forget that experience. The second to last point is around friction. So the process is unknown. People are not feeding back and complaining generally. So actually they have to then research how to feed back and how to complain, and that's effort. And they're perhaps unwilling to do that. And then lastly, and probably most interestingly from our point of view, we heard this from 2 users of the 10 full interviews we did. People were really forgiving. So what we heard is that people make mistakes. This could be a one-off. And bear in mind that one of these users who said that was also someone who'd had an experience where the driver had refused to take them. They turned up and refused to take them because of the colour of their skin. And they didn't complain. They said, I'm going to accept that, that this person will learn from that mistake. We had a conversation. It wasn't a violent or abusive conversation that took place. It was very matter of fact. And he said, I hope they learn from that. People make mistakes, and I hope that if I make a mistake, that people will give me the same benefit of, and allow me to learn from it. Like, incredibly forgiving. So those are just some of the things that we heard, and possibly account for why complaints feel so low, given the the number of situations that people are telling us where they feel unsafe. So I'm going to jump into some recommendations now. So we started this research taking a broad view of safety and just trying to understand what passengers and drivers were telling us about safety in the round. However, there was this assumption that a national database could help to improve safety. And the assumption there is based on the fact that there is data sharing that is happening. And if that data sharing was easier to do, then we would get to know about drivers that were applying for licenses that shouldn't, or perhaps contravening their license, so it could be revoked or suspended more easily. However, based on a sample of one licensing authority we've spoken to, there's very little data sharing that is actually happening, and there's very little complaints and feedback that would actually increase that data sharing. So based on what we know, next slide, please, Jen. Based on what we know, there's no strong grounds or benefit case for a database in and of itself, based on the current process of just sharing data. However, what we've learned from the research that we've done is that to meet the needs of users to feel safe, there are a number of different things that could be put in place, products and services that could be built and that would meet those users' needs and enable them to feel safer and enable the industry to deliver a better service. But the precursor for that would be the better quality license data and modern technologies within which to integrate with that data. So currently data is held, I say, by these 22 licensing authorities. Lots of them use different systems. It's very unclear as to the quality of that data and whether the data is in a fit state to be shared using modern application protocol interfaces like APIs to do that. So if that were in place, then you'd be able to build things like a feedback service where the passenger will be able to feedback to the licensing authority and potentially complain too, but certainly feedback so that the quality of the service could be assessed and improved. And I always struggle with this, and I'm on my way back, tracking service, just to mimic the kinds of behaviours we're already seeing, so that a user could tie their message that they're sending to their friends or family to a specific vehicle and a specific driver. Or a license checker service. This taxi and this driver are legitimate. Again, all information which is currently very difficult for the passenger to actually to get and or to have trust in. Next slide, please. That's all well and good, but how might that actually that work in practice? And this is just a how might we thing. This is just a reckon. We haven't done any work in this area particularly. But the main interaction between the data that bleeds out around licensing and the passenger is the driver badge. And I'm sure we've all been in taxis where we've perhaps tried to look for that just to see, okay, who is this person? And invariably, it's actually really difficult to find. And if it is there, it's actually on the large part illegible. Certainly for me, my eyesight's getting worse. And I was in a taxi the other day, and I could see the badge, but could not read anything on it, and certainly couldn't make out whether the driver was the same driver that was taking me in the car. So we think this is one area in which, if you were to improve the products and services to support users' needs, that could be a really exciting area to support the interaction with the user. So, for example, they could have an easy reference number to use in logging that journey, or in identifying whether the driver in the cab were legit, or to provide some feedback on that driver. It feels like an interaction. It feels like an artifact which is of a much older non-digital age, and we could bring it into the present. So on that note, those are some of the findings. The report will be coming up soon, and James is going to tell you a bit more about that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, James. So just a quick note from me to say that driver safety came up in a Senate debate last week, and we're also aware from this discovery, the work that we've done and all the driver and operator interviews, that driver safety is a major issue. So we will be recommending that as a piece of future research and activity going forward. So drivers, please be aware that we're very conscious that your needs also need to be met. So what's next on the passenger safety side of things? So we're going to write up a full report, a detailed one, and then a sort of highlights, more brief document as well for easy access, easy reading, bilingual, of course. And we're going to share that report through all channels, so it will be widely available publicly. And then the taxi bill team will use our report and findings to help shape part of the bill. Of course, this is going into a much part of a much wider bill, and other bills in transport that are happening at the same time. So Adrian's going to touch now on basically the wider context of all the bills and things happening in the trade. So Adrian, if you'd like to jump in there.
Thanks, James. So we recently consulted on proposals for a taxi bill, and we've received about 150 responses, and we did consultation events for the trade around Wales and had lots of discussions with other people who are interested. 2 weeks ago, we published a summary of responses to our white paper proposals, and now ministers will take all of that information and the results of this research, reflect on that and decide on the way forward. And as soon as we're able to provide an update on the bill, we will do that. And I think now we have got time for some questions, so I'm going to hand back to James to chair that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks everyone for coming, and now it's time for Q&A. So please raise your hand using the raise hand button on the on Teams, and we'll answer your questions accordingly. Hi, Dave. Would you like to ask a question?
I will. Just let me unplug that first. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, so yeah, a little bit. Yeah. Hi.
1 second. Is that better?
Oh, much better. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Let me just put my. I can be doing that while I'm talking. So there's a few issues that have been raised within this presentation. One of them being to book directly with drivers. That would only apply to Hackney carriage drivers, because you cannot pre-book directly with a private hire driver. To do so will be an offence on part of the driver. So they have to go through a private hire operator. Lack of wheelchair accessible vehicles. There was a recent Act of Parliament in April 2022, which addressed this and pushed away from the idea of 100% wheelchair accessible vehicles, and stipulated instead that all vehicles must have the facility to provide transport for wheelchair users, which turned more of a focus on boot space of vehicles in order to transport a wheelchair that's been folded up and put into the boot. Purely and simply because there was a huge difference between a wheelchair user and a wheelchair bound person. Wheelchair bound people being very much in the minority. The issue with wheelchair accessible vehicles is twofold. Number one, with the push towards electric vehicles right now, there is only one available, and it's around £80,000. Very limited availability, very limited affordability, especially since the trade is trying to recover from COVID. So when as larger vehicles are being manufactured on electric, the maximum axle weight is already exceeded by, or at least matched by, the weight of the battery, which makes it very difficult to convert. On top of that, because of the location of the battery, it turns the floor into a no drill zone, so they cannot be converted. So these are all things to very much to take into consideration when looking at wheelchair accessible vehicles, and it is something that the industry itself is extremely keen on, and we are very much focusing on, because we are aware of the need and we want to satisfy that need, but we're limited as well by availability of vehicles. The other thing is I welcome the mention of driver safety, because most of this report seems to be complaints and drivers not being recognised as being the professionals that they are and providing the professional service that they do and have done for many, many years. Within, as was quite rightly said, in the Institute of Licensing meeting a couple of weeks ago in Northampton, there was a focus on the overall safety, which includes passengers and drivers, because drivers are being attacked out there. They are transporting drunk people, they're transporting aggressive people, they are being attacked. And you mentioned within this report about what do we do if somebody is drunk and they fall asleep in the back of the vehicle. That's an extremely tricky situation, because if you open a door to nudge them and wake them up, you then get accused of attempted rape. It's a highly dangerous and vulnerable situation that the drivers are in, and that really does need to be considered when writing the report and when introducing these bills. Driver safety is just as paramount as passenger safety. And I'll stop talking now.
No, David, thank you. Really appreciate you taking the time to give your feedback there. And yeah, 100%. Drivers do a fantastic service, so we want to make sure that they're looked after as well. So I'm going to hand over to Adrian to come back to some of your points there. And then if any of the UR team have anything to add as well, please raise your hand.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Some good points. Certainly recognise all of the difficulties around WAVs, but it's an area where we're going to be looking at what scope there is to do better. So further conversations to come around that. On the aspect of driver safety, I mean, I absolutely agree that that is a concern and an area that we'll be looking at. To be fair, the focus of this work was kind of started with how can sharing information help to keep people safer, and I guess there were some more obvious ways in which sharing information would help to protect passengers rather than drivers, but absolutely acknowledge that driver safety is important, and if there are information sharing recommendations that can help to keep drivers safe, we will certainly be interested in those.
James, do you want to add anything there?
No, not particularly. Like our focus was more on passenger safety, but we did obviously talked about it in this presentation. We did talk to drivers and recognise a couple of things that David has brought out, and hopefully that quote that I provided gives a sense of how important it is.
Thanks. I believe Myra and Harriet had their hand up next, if they'd like to go next.
Hi, I'm Myra. Thank you for a lovely presentation, and it was very evocative as well in terms of passenger-driver interaction. I'm interested, did any of the people that you were interviewing, either passengers or drivers, reference Uber and kind of how that was changing their expectations? And I'm just interested in attitudinal change as a result of market changes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, they did actually. James, if you'd like to answer that in terms of the user research side when it was mentioned.
Yeah, sure. So we it's interesting this. So we spoke to a real spread of people geographically, and also as I've said, people from minority groups, and actually they were not using Uber as much, and the reason for that is that Uber, I think at the time we were doing the research, was only available in Cardiff. I think it may have been one taxi somewhere else. I think someone referenced, but it was certainly the big city was where it was prevalent. And the research that we did, we only spoke to a handful of people that were from Cardiff. So there were people using it, But in terms of behaviour change, it didn't come out in the research as perhaps as much as we'd expect. I just remembered where the other Uber passenger was. It was near Bangor, and that user talked a lot about Uber, and actually blew some of the myths about Uber for me anyway, saying that actually taking a hackney cab for them was deemed to be kind of more of the luxury option, and that Uber was and they would usually prefer to take a hackney cab if they had the time, but if they're in a rush, they would take Uber. So that was kind of interesting, but we didn't hear about the things which we might ordinarily expect to hear about Uber. So the booking process, the ability to track cars as much as we'd have thought. Tracking came up. People were aware of it. People certainly felt that was a fantastic thing to do to help you feel safer, which is why I referenced it in the learnings there. But it wasn't something that everyone was telling us, and that's just because Uber wasn't being used by a lot of the people we spoke to.
Yeah, thank you, Myra, and thank you, James, for that response. Admin at Wrexham, would you like to go next? Sorry, your name's not available on the screen. Sorry, mate.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for that. Name is Gareth Thomas. I'm a private hire operator here in Wrexham and a private hire driver. I run a luxury chauffeur service, and if you look across in the chat, this is the notification we typically look at sending out to passengers. So what we've got is a photo of the driver, a photo of the vehicle, including the number plate. We've got the date, the time, we've got details of the journey, we've got the options to call driver, SMS the driver, and this is by default to every booking we take. Turning over £250,000 currently, and in the realm of passenger safety, I think that this gives the passengers what they need in terms of safety, because the driver, the vehicle, everything is identifiable. And furthermore, you might notice there are no private hire plates on the vehicle. So the private hire plates, we have special dispensation here in Wrexham. We don't have to display them. And my argument is that private hire plates might actually be counterintuitive, and for the cars that are plated, they might lull customers, passengers, into a false sense of safety and security. So it's a big conversation there.
Yeah, awesome. Adrian, would you like to touch on the license plate side of things, if that's been discussed already? Thank you, Gareth.
Well, in our consultation, we kind of proposed some standards, some vehicle standards. We received lots and lots of comments on the standards we proposed for drivers' vehicles and operators, and we will be taking all of that away and thinking very carefully and doing more, speaking more to stakeholders before we kind of come to any firm views about what exactly the vehicle standards ought to be.
Fantastic, thank you, Adrian. And James, did you have anything to add there, mate?
Only that I think it's a really valid point. I think it's trust, isn't it? It comes down to what should the passenger be trusting here, and I think this is where government can play a role in brokering that relationship between the operator and the driver and the passenger. It's a trusted source of information. If you get that right, then and provide the standards around that appropriately, then I think it would help a lot.
Awesome. And Tom, do you have anything to touch on there as well?
Sorry, I was just going to mention something that's related to something that was asked in the chat, but I'm aware that Kat had her hand up prior to me.
Yeah, fab. Kat, I'll go to you first. Kat, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, kind of. So one, I work for Disability Wales, so we've done an awful lot of research of our own on taxis and private hire vehicles and things like that, the problems that disabled people face throughout Wales. So if you are interested in our research, then please get in touch about that. But also, I really need a lot of the language that's been used here to change, because Wales is a social model country, and calling people wheelchair bound or people with disabilities, things like that, that's quite insulting. So yeah, if language could be a focus too. But also, I've had a few conversations in the chat about booking taxis, booking private hire vehicles, and it's really not great for wheelchair users at all. And this is even when there are sufficient stock. They just don't want to know when you're a wheelchair user. You know, even if you're booking 2 hours in advance, no, they can't do that. They won't do that. I had an important event to get to because of my work, and they took all my colleagues in standard cabs, but because I needed a wheelchair taxi, they said no, I would only be allowed it 15 minutes before I needed it. It then turned up an hour after I needed it, and I got to my event 10 minutes before it started. I was the last person to walk in, and for somebody that's like, you know, part of the National Disabled People's Organisation in Wales, that was incredibly embarrassing, because I was othered yet again by another service, and it's just got to stop everywhere. And the government changing the laws on wheelchair user taxis, for permanent wheelchair users, because they shouldn't be, because we're in the minority. Well, every minority is a minority, and when you're specifically calling out one group of people, then that's again othering them, and that should not be allowed. And we all know that the UK government has an absolute vendetta against disabled people in general. So I really hope that the Welsh government can fight against this and continue to support disabled people, and continue to recommend that taxis for wheelchair users and permanent wheelchair users are a priority, because that's what it needs to be. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing, Kat. I really appreciate that. So with regards, I'll try and answer the sort of 3 segments there. So that with regards to the information, data sharing and the research you guys have done, absolutely. After this call, I'll send an email to you, set up some time. And that, you know, coincides with our second point about the language used. For sure, we want to be inclusive. My apologies if we've not been. So our intention is never to insult or get it wrong. So we're always here to learn. So thank you for sharing that with us as well. Much appreciated. And the third part about access in general, I'm going to hand over to the user research team. You know, we're acutely aware that it is an issue, and of course we want to fix that. And you know, 100% will engage with you to work around that as well as this progresses. So yeah, James, if you'd like to, I see you have your hand raised. If you'd like to add a point there, please do.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, thanks, Kat. And just to back up what James was saying there about use of inclusive language, we tried hard to try and get that right. We referenced the gov.uk inclusive language guidance, etc. So it wasn't due to any lack of intent on our part. But the what you mentioned there with regard to wait times came up a lot, and the reason why I didn't I didn't push that more in the presentation today is it's a rather tenuous link to safety, which was the focus of the work. However, it was a concern for lots of the users we spoke to, and particularly those people who are using wheelchairs, and like I said, the person who was blind. Wait times for them were probably of greater concern on a day-to-day than anything else. They had very little confidence in the amount of time it would take for the taxi to turn up, and that really affected their day-to-day life. No. But we'll definitely reference that in the report.
Yeah, for sure. And like I said, Kat, with them, we'll put some time in with you as well, and just make sure we hear everything you guys have done on the research side as well. So we're going into this and next steps with as much information as possible. So thank you for your question. Tom, you had your hand raised earlier. Did you want to make your point?
I can do, yeah. I'm just conscious that we've got a couple of minutes left, but it was around Paul's question around the use of CCTV in taxis. So obviously that wasn't an explicit part of our question, because we were speaking to passengers about their experiences and their needs and allowing them to kind of lead that conversation. But particularly in, it didn't actually come up at all, I don't think, with passengers. But when we spoke to drivers, and we spoke to a fair few, lots of them brought that up. The presence of CCTVs in their cabs being of something, being a kind of importance to them, something that helps with not just passenger safety but their own safety. It can document what goes on, so there's a bit of an audit trail to what happens. But there was a prohibitive element, which is the cost. It costs £200-300 for that, and some people don't feel that it's worth the cost. They struggle to afford that. So it was something that came up, and I, along with I think the rest of the team, are hoping that we will go on to look at driver safety as well to some degree, and perhaps that's something that can feed in.
Thank you, Tom. Jem, did we have any questions in the chat that we want to go through? I'm conscious
we have been keeping up with the questions, and yeah, thank you all for your comments. We'll definitely review all of these as part of our next steps as well. So yeah, no, I think we're good, James.
Brilliant. Well, thanks everyone for attending today. Really appreciate it. As soon as the report is published, we're going to cascade it to everyone. So much appreciated. Hope everyone has a lovely week, and good luck to Wales in the quarterfinals. Thank you all. Diolch.
Thanks all. Diolch.
Thanks everyone. Hwyl fawr.